thank you all very much for being here this lunchtime. It's a great honor to have Professor Edward Sekler here with us today. As you all know, the GSD has a very long history of connections with FAS in the sense that there used to be, and Professor Smith is here in the audience. I know she did some research. There used to be actually an undergraduate program in architecture in the college a long time ago, and the transformation of that undergraduate program later on led to the formation also of VES and the Carpenter Center, and there are many people here in the room, which is fabulous, who know a lot about that history in a way that I don't. And it would be great to hear from them. Obviously, a number of people here at the school were instrumental in terms of the evolution of the Carpenter Center, and Edward is really one of the key figures of that history, and obviously in connection with the anniversary of the formation of the Carpenter Center, it is wonderful for us to hear something about the history of that connection. And also this links to the exhibition that we're all going to see probably around 1 o'clock in the library of the drawings of the Carpenter Center that we are very lucky and delighted to be able to exhibit with the support of the exhibition department, and Peter Christensen, who was the curator of that exhibition, is also going to be here to help us along with the way that the exhibition was put together. More recently, with the support of Michael Hayes, Professor Michael Hayes, who is on the faculty in the Department of Architecture, we have now established what is soon to become a concentration in architecture as a collaboration between FAS, Department of History of Art and Architecture, and the GSD. And we actually now have a cohort of undergraduates who are in their very first semester working upstairs, in a way recreating, in some ways, the original history of the connection between the GSD and FAS by actually having undergraduates work in the context of a graduate school. In the past few years, we've also tried quite hard to rebuild our relationship with the Carpenter Center and with the VES, and with the new director, David Roderick, who is incredibly supportive and enthusiastic. We are beginning to do more things between the Carpenter Center and the GSD, and indeed there are now more of the faculty from VES who are also teaching classes that are jointly shared between the GSD and VES. So I think there are some very positive signs, but there are many more things that we could do. What is exciting in the brief conversations that I've had with Edward and with Pat and others is really the incredible connection that used to exist, and it would be great to hear more about that from Edward, from the time that he was the director. Normally, I get a few bullet points of comments, but somehow in my folder today, I actually discovered that someone in our office had prepared a little bio of you. And knowing that there are so many former students and colleagues and friends, and that there are also a lot of new people here who don't know, I just thought actually that it would be helpful to read a little bit of this history of Edward. I know that some of the information is probably incorrect, and he will correct it, but I think it's good if you don't know. how is it that Edward came to be here? So I think you all know that Professor Edward Seckler is the Osgood Hooker Professor of Visual Art Emeritus, Professor of Architecture Emeritus at Harvard University. He graduated with a degree with distinction in architecture from the Technical University in Vienna. Is that correct so far? That's right. Working as a practicing architect in the city. So he started and he continues to be an architect at heart. Beginning in 1946 and then teaching and working as a research assistant in 1945 to 1953, as a lecturer in 1953. He then moved to London, and I know that when I was in London that Edward and I talked, and he actually still remains a lifetime member of the AA from those times. So I also remember that from my time in London. And then continued there and studied planning and regional research, and then went home to the Warburg Institute and worked with Rudolf Wilkover, where he completed a dissertation on the evolution of staircases in British architecture, granted by Warburg in 1948. Now, you should also know that this year we have a group of students who are doing, they've just done a studio last year, but they're actually continuing that project called The Elements of Architecture, and they're working with Graham Koolhaas. And they're in fact now doing research on the history of things like staircases, corridors, and so on. So we are going to need your dissertation, Edward, because it was going to be very useful, I think, for the next Venice Biennale. And this also led to a publication on Wren and his place in European architecture, which was originally published in 1956. Edward then came to Harvard in the 50s as a visiting professor, then became an associate professor during the time of Walter Gropius, and then was appointed, I think, by Jose Luis Sert, and in 1960 became a full professor at the school. And really focused a lot on the transformation of the project of both history, but also the teaching of architecture during this period.
Just, Gropius had retired when I came.
See, I told you. But it's interesting, actually, what Gropius was doing here also, because, you know, a couple of years ago, we had a wonderful exhibition of Gropius in Japan and the photographs that he did about the history of Japanese architecture. So there were interesting people in that room. There's a lot here about your influence or interest on Cistercian architecture, which maybe people didn't know that. And one of your students, Peter Ferguson. And then the fact that you developed an interest in cultural and architectural heritage of the Kathmandu Valley. And to this day, I think Edward continues his role in the context of UNESCO and really focusing very much not just on the study of history of architecture, contemporary modern architecture, but also this issue of preservation has been an important part of what you have been doing. Then Edward became the director of the Carpenter Center in 1963 until 1976. Is that right? No? Pat says no. You're saying yes, and Pat says no.
The directorship, I think, was 56.
Or did I actually 56?
Earlier than that.
Already
Worked
50s.
here in studies.
Oh. So he started at the Carpenter Center even before then, in 56. And he has since then still continued this research on Nepal preservation, the founding of the Kathmandu Valley Preservation Trust. The list obviously goes on. But I would also mention, in addition to many of the books, Edward has published a book that I'm sure you all know, which is the book on Le Corbusier at Work, The Genesis of the Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts, which was published by Harvard University Press in 1978, which I guess is the most relevant book here. As we continue to hear from Edward. I understand that a number of others, Will Greenman, Don Freeman, Howard Elkus, David Hamlin, and Hans Buchwald might also make some comments or not. It's very improvisational as far as I know.
They
But-
will make them when their work is shown
Or when their work is shown.
on the screen.
So Howard Elkus's work will be shown, he will speak about it, and he will receive a criticism from everyone else. Howard, be careful what you say. Anyway, we're all looking forward to hearing Professor Seckler. This is an incredible opportunity, and really thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to Edward, and thanks for Pat for making this possible. So please welcome Professor Edward Seckler.
Thank you, Dean. And I want to begin thanking with you the faculty and staff who have been so important. And last but not least, the students who may not make a big appearance about their opinion about somebody, but it is not without importance if they feel it would be a good visitor, or if they say, oh, he's clueless. So, thank you all. And I apologize if at the very beginning I'll read a little, because there are the historic facts, and of course I was thrilled to be very serious with the exactness of date and so on by my teacher, Whitcover. I'm happy that I was invited to help you celebrate the 50th birthday of the Carpenter Center. The building exists having owed a good deal to GSD. Perhaps wouldn't even have come without GSD. I learned after I had begun teaching at Harvard University in 1955, 1 year before a most important document was published. It was the time when Nathan Pusey was president. He was the president for quite a long time, and it turned out, a real reformer who wanted to have the future come very directly into the university. It will be hard for you to visualize what Harvard University was like 50 years ago, when during my first stay, I was invited into a Harvard house, Elliott House, and there were still women who came to do your room. It didn't last long. And also, if you came in with being a man with a woman, you had, of course, to sign up at the door, and it was strictly checked where you were going, etc., etc. So it was strict also in the dress, how you came to dinner. I wouldn't come to give a lecture if I didn't have clothes here with a beautiful cravat, to have an open shirt 50 years ago would have been misunderstood as somebody who isn't quite right in his hand. The important document that was published and that I'm sure quite a few of you know about and have maybe even read some of its 155 pages, it was, I quote, report of the Committee on the Visual Arts at Harvard University, 1956. This was the result of a decision in 1952 when the Committee of Overseers, and you know that the Overseers, the committee, are indeed a seriously important part of the self-organization of this free university. They take their business very serious, and they are very important people. Well, having visited the Department of Fine Arts, decided a study was needed. And the Committee on the Visual Arts was appointed in June 1954, with John Nicholas Brown as leader, who in June 1955, you see how fast it went, wrote, and I'm quoting now, and this was supported by the president, what this was written. Now, quickly, there were 7 members in this important committee, including Brown, the leader, John Nicholas Brown. The 7 were Francis Capper, class of 38, Dean of Education at Harvard. Now, class of 38, he was a quite young dean, but that was not unusual at that time. Then there were 2 Yales, one from the theater, and the Dean of the School of Fine Arts, Charles Sawyer. From Oberlin, Wolfgang Stechow as Professor of Fine Arts, and George Wald, Professor of Biology at Harvard, honored by a Nobel Prize, part of a Nobel Prize that was divided between 3 people. The Nobel Prize in 1967 was in physiology or medicine. It means in both. They didn't quite know for which to mention it. Both. And it was, he had to do for the rest of his life about seeing, about the eye. He clarified that there are special receptors for the color blue and how this is done. And he also took a great interest in the actual life around him. I used to still see him, and with his wife, going around the little pond outside Cambridge quite regularly into a whole old age. Finally, there was on the committee John Walker, the chief curator of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Executive secretary who wrote much of the text that we read was Professor Lane Faison, in charge of the Department of Art at Williams College. The recommendations I'll read in selection. The interest of the, and this is now how altogether arts and including architecture came into Harvard University was strictly for the humanities, to train pastors, to train lawyers, and so obviously a big change would be brought about. I'm quoting, the interest of the Lawrence Scientific School in the applied arts and sciences made that school, that Lawrence Scientific School, the building where that was, exists still as the, I believe, now it's called the Department or the School of Engineering or something like that. Since the interest in the applied arts and science was there, it made it natural that the school was one out of which evolved in 1935 the Graduate School of Design, that is, the Graduate School of Architecture, Landscape Architecture, and City Planning. I was surprised that this was, in a way, so recent. In 1935, I was already 15 years old, but there were these antecedents that I have mentioned at that school that go back in the 19th century. Now, very briefly, a selection from the recommendations. That the history of art be pursued with continued vigor is one recommendation. The history of art. That theory and practice, the first of which was used to be taught at Harvard with distinction, exists no more. And the second of which is now scattered between the Department of Arts, of Architecture, Sciences, and Fine Arts. So, fine arts and arts, in the way these words are used, have different meanings, so they have much to do with each other. So it is recommended that we grouped together under a new department to be called the Department of Design. That is a very important recommendation, the Department of Design. And then, coming to the end, the committee recommends that a design center be constructed to house the new department and related activities of the Graduate School of Design, and that it be located near the Folk Museum and the Robinson Hall. The design, Robinson Hall was then the history for a while. And then GSD was in Robinson Hall. The design center should also serve the entire university community. Often we have thought that going into a new building with furniture and so on and sad are breathed with difficulty. Where was the designer for this? These people recommend that something should be done. A search of the site began, and we can start now. Yes, and this is from the report. And you will see, if you can see it, here it is. Yep. That the design department is next to here, to the fort. The president had the idea that there could be a kind of art center in part of the campus. And a number of sites were investigated, and they all turned out, unfortunately, not available because it was already reserved for another building, or it was too far out. At that time, Cambridge was not as overcrowded as it is today. Or, well, there were many other reasons why they finally came. They had up there along various sites where the ugly skyscraper stands today, all failed. So, and it was clear that the theater was, which was, it's written here, would be linked to to design as well as to the existing museum. But this was all, there was not room enough. And so the theater was built further out. We all know where it is. But the design center finally ended near the fog. And of course, had to suffer from a gigantic building in the end being built next to it. But when it was young, it was freestanding, and it was something really new for the university. It wasn't necessarily welcomed by everybody. A lot of the more, shall we say, traditional, important professors thought it was a disgrace. A friend of mine saw it, or one of these old gentlemen with his umbrella was sort of hitting the building or the floor in front of the building. The disgrace. But on the other hand, it had very wonderful consequences. Yeah, I could have said that a site was also chosen in the front of Lowell House, another site at Humboldt that doesn't exist anymore, where there are more student dwellings. But it remained as it, the next place. And there you see now the reality in the air view where it stands, and you at the same time see the finished plan. And about that plan alone one could give a very nice lecture. But we have to hurry on to the next place. The finished new building, the finished new design center, which got the beginning of its name, Carpenter. Not as many people think that because carpenters had worked there, but because there was a donor whose son had been in the architecture school, I think, who donated wonderfully so this building could be finished. Now, to study in detail the building of this is not part of my talk. I can only recommend, this is very thoroughly described in the book Le Corbusier at Work, which former student who became a doctor at Harvard in a department here. It's in the title of the book, together with my name, because I was his doctor father, but he worked very beautifully, very thoroughly about the prehistory, about the documents, and then about the technical detail. So I can only recommend that book if you are interested and want to find out more. And William Curtis, I'm talking about in this case, we'll talk about it on the 16th in the architectural center in downtown. Boston. On the 16th, I expect it will be posted or will be on the web, the details. What happened after the book had been written, I have to mention. The fact that a very big extension was built next to it of the Fog Museum needed a place, it's all very tight there, where the building materials and machinery and so on could be at times. So somebody had the idea this was in the way, that a part of this ramp that you know goes right through the building could be cut off and saved somewhere and then be brought back and attached again. It was possible to convince that this was not a good idea, not a realistic idea. And so instead the ramp stayed but was protected particularly strongly. Concrete restoration, when you walk to it today, is absolutely necessary. So the concrete is first rate. It was done by the, at that time, best firm, and the man in charge of it said we knew we couldn't make money here, but we did it for the pride. And the problem that the people that Corbu wanted green roofs. There's a sketch of him where he wrote from time to time a hill. But you know that there are rules about the danger of people falling off of flat roofs and other reasons that it was impossible just to have green roofs everywhere, but one works on it that in certain areas where it's possible to have parts of a green roof. But we have to hurry on, so next we are inside now, and you can see that it was something where people really liked to come and work the next. In this case, in two-dimensional, the next. And here we have the teacher for whom these drawings were made, and I hope he will say a few words. Will?
Yeah. Well, the basic drawing class was really organized to introduce students to seeing in the fullest sense of the way one might describe that. And it had, yes, and it had to do with introducing them to the most basic level of response.
Can you speak to the mic, sorry, because
Trying
they
to-
take
That big audible? Hardly audible? Okay. Okay. And I had them start with, can you sign your name? And of course everybody could do that. And then we went on from there to get them to sign it backwards, and then upside down and backwards, and upside down and forwards, and it began to make patterns, and it proceeded from there. And by the time we got to the end of the second term, for those with the bad judgment to come back for another round, we finished up at the Constitution Wharf in Boston Navy Yard, the largest perspective in the area that you'll see with no straight lines in it. And if I'd done my job, they were ready for it by that time.
Well, we have two more pictures. The next place.
Oh, yeah, matter of fact, I have in my grab bag. Take a little while to get these out. They'll catch under everything. We had a number of materials, some of which are no longer. Let me just put that on, get some shadow. This is actually galvanized window screen, okay, which comes flat and it keeps the mosquitoes out mostly. And what's remarkable about it as a product is that it will take three-dimensional form if carefully worked. If you just work it very superficially, then it just makes cylindrics and conicals, things like that. But it generates profoundly three-dimensional. These are all rectangles that make this up. And all of it was formed by hand by the students. And the second one, which is sort of a alien's trombone. But again, students began to understand that you could do one thing on the square, and you had to do quite different things when you were on the bias. And all of these, of course, take advantage of that bias because the wires were able to slip very, very slightly one to the other. So there was a lot that students had to find out because I didn't say anything about any of this at the beginning. I said, find out what it will do. He's not going to tell us what's going to be on the exam. It didn't work like that. I said, guys, the exam, if you choose to take it, is being given by you to you, and it's all the time, just in case you were wondering. Okay, so similar things happened in the drawing course, and we went on to deal with letter forms, with grayscale, with all of that. Eventually, in the second term, getting to problems of composing, organizing the page, realizing what invention was in a graphic sense. And
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Myself, thank you very much to George Wall for saying that he thought the most important course he taught was his basic biology. Same was true with vision. Give the ice cream.
Behind you.
Oh, there you are.
Next. Speaking of three-dimensional, you see just people working in the Carpenter Center. And the next. And there's the teaching that where you do nothing like drawing or forming, you just educate the mind. And it is a wonderful example. This is in the Carpenter Center, an upstairs seminar room which the people loved. You can see why. And the main teaching there was Ivor Richards, the great specialist professor in English literature. That is its experience, its criticism, its teaching, and who also was, with his wife, a great mountaineer. Experience of art when I went into the mountains. The next, now I come to that short moment where I have to point out that we had, of course, to organize all this. And this is from the 1968-69 publication that explains it in detail. What you have, it's on top for different stages, from freshman to when you have finished. and then vertically what happens and how these things, what is being taught, become stronger for your mind as you go on. I can't go into detail, it would take too long. But it was a wonderful thing to observe how people might change in a positive sense. A continuous explanation into the course activities. For the first time here, I also have to mention that from the beginning there was a wish to include what we finally called light and communication. That means visual communication, that means what we called, as I said, light and communication, that means photography, film, and TV. I can only mention Bob Gardner as a beginning there, his work, Derek Land for also in artistic film, Len Gittelman, a great photographer, and how all this interlocked. And it's interesting that Gropius, who was on the visiting committee, came to me to say that he was so happy to see that, but we had to be careful not to become too strict. That is, not to get too much of a system into which you are put and must go, but to leave the necessary freedom. The next, please. I have taken this example of a rather rare example of a project by Le Corbusier that was investigated by this student critically, very interesting. He, however, I remember, was very self-centered, and I never knew whether he listened to any teaching. At any rate, next, this was a Le Corbusier building, and here we have Le Corbusier at the beginning in the Carpenter Center, and there was an exhibition of Le Corbusier work there, as you can see. We had at that time exhibition designer Dan Goetz. Next, please. In the same year, that is in the opening year, the birthday year, in 1963, writing, the process, and the image. And here we have somebody who can talk about it, because he helped collect exhibition material, and somebody who designed the installation and the catalog, and that is Buchwald for the material, and Donald Freeman for the design. But I have to rush on because soon, and I want to see a few other shows still. There is The Shape of Sound, which was a beautiful show. And again, it was Freeman who did the installation. There was a long review that was enthusiastic, printed in the Christian Science Monitor. Twice this review was now Freeman is here, and so is, of course, who I mentioned before. I mentioned two. Yeah. So Buchwald could say something, and Freeman. But the question is, we have to go on. But it is possible to talk to them afterwards. They can tell you a lot about how this was collected and done, but let's get on. The next. Yes, the title you can see there, and again, Buchwald here had a good deal of work. The next, I'll show you some things of this proportion exhibition. Next. You see, we went quite wide, so a lot of material had to be collected. Next. And it was always tried to get a three-dimensional presentation. The next, please. That's not an error. That was in the proportion show. And the next. Whereas this was in its own right. Nature does it by itself. And that is what interested the proportion people, whereas the one you see here was done by a scientist who, however, ended up as an artist, a painter, and you can see science led him to art. And the next. This is a similar case. The late Arthur Lowe, who was really a scientist, dealing with copper and its behavior, found the irregularities on the different levels of what he was working with. And so he made a very nice show which came to order in a different way than the people who did the proportion show. But we had all three. The next. Of course, we had a show part of the Bauhaus. It was not made here. We got it sent and only dealt with it. And we had this wonderful also designer, graphic designer, Toshihiro Katayama, exhibition designer, who did a good job there. The next, relating to a show that was also done by Katayama, but with material which Hans Buchwald again had cataloged and researched, and the bent wood that has survived into our age. The next, this was the show, part of the show, and bentwood chairs. Such a bentwood chair was used by Joseph Hoffman, the architect, and in a famous work, and recently has been bought for a price high in the thousands, whereas when it was new, it was a quite reasonable price. The next, all these shows that were done by Toshi Katayama, this was the show, a beautiful show, approaches to color. He was at home there, Toshi, in design and color. Unfortunately, he had hoped to work for this exhibition, but he died not all too long, and there will be a memorial getting together on April 18, Thursday, April 18, in the evening, and it is in the Carpenter Center, between 6 and 8 p.m. if you want to come and see it. The other death that we really felt very strongly was that of Mirko. You see there, the Fosse Ariadne. This was a work in Italy, in natural grottos. The Nazis drove the people they wanted to get rid of, and horrible things happened there. And so they asked Mirko to do something, and he did this immemorial exhibition of the Fosse Ariadne. And after his death, which was in 1970, there was this show which again Hoshi had done. He was a very fertile artist, Peter Roth. Some of it survives in Harvard buildings. Well, I'm coming to the end now. The next, again, that was not a show that we made here. It was sent from Holland. The search for total construction, art, architecture, and town planning in the USSR 1917 to 1932. The next. Again, Toshi did this show transformation. The next. And it was a very lovely show. Again, I could tell you a lot. But this is some idea. And finally, the next. And I'll end with this. You see what it was. Anonymous art from market, and it was suggested, this is interesting, to do this show, what the ladies would buy in the market, in the supermarket, etc. George Wald, the Nobel Prize laureate, had suggested that. I must end now. I know we have to go on, but I also want to end by thanking you for coming, and maybe these periodicals can be shown in another context. But I want to quickly, but from heart, thank you who helped me, the committee for the exhibition, Benjamin Broski, Chantal Blackley, and Dan Borelli. Then in the library, well, I could say everybody, but especially in this case, Ines Salguendo. Then I want to thank Doug Cogger, who takes care of the microscopes, the microphones. And finally, last but not least, the person without whom there wouldn't be the pictures on this, over there, who worked quickly, wonderfully. Emily Thompson, who is the one and answers the essay next. But for here, there won't be any next. And we'll go on to see the drawings over with Peter Christensen, with the curator of the show. So thank you again for coming, and I'm sorry that I wasn't fast enough to discuss everything. Thank you.
So it's a pity because there are so many things that are still outstanding and could be said. You're absolutely right that we miss Professor Katayama. Wish he had been here. There are a number of wonderful people here who we were hoping that you would say something. And I don't know whether before we leave, whether Howard or Hans or David can make some brief comments, and then we go. I think now that we have this opportunity, it would be great to hear from you all. Yes? Please, take a seat for 1 second, and
Yeah.
Peter will be quick when we go through this. Howard, say a few words.
I'll be very brief. I think my first comment, it's hard to believe 50 years have passed, but unfortunately or fortunately, I'm not sure which, I was the class of '63, so I was one of those lucky students that remembers when Corbusier came to Harvard and how exciting this whole venture was at the time. It was amazing because the influences of Corbusier were here throughout the school, both in architecture, city planning, and art, and through the work of Jose Luis Cert and his partners and others. This was an amazing building, an amazing time, and an amazing thing that it's at Harvard. This is Corbusier's only work in the United States. He did have some influence on the United Nations, but this is his work. And when you see the drawings next door, it brings back to me my awe when I originally saw these drawings many years ago, because they are not just the architecture of Corbusier, they are the art of Corbusier. And this building nearby represents all of those things. It's an amazing building, very forward-looking. There's still lessons in it. Amazing that this man came to Harvard, saw how Harvard worked, the paths of Harvard, and made them three-dimensional. But it wasn't just that they were three-dimensional. He took you through space and time, and he also revealed the inner workings of what was going on there. This was kind of revolutionary at the time. All these buildings were sealed up. You had to go inside. You don't have to go inside this building to understand what's going on. We're just getting to that point in our university buildings and so forth. Anyway, I want to say one other thing. The gentleman who has just been speaking was one of the stars in Harvard at the time. I will tell you, in my entire experience, he is the only professor who regularly drew applause at the end of his lectures. He is both a great professor and teacher, but he also is a great student, and that's what we appreciate.
I'll start off very differently. I was working as an architect in Milan when Edward came to Italy, and we had a talk, and he ended up hiring me to come to Harvard. And of course, I didn't bother to ask him what kind of building I'm going to work in. That wasn't one of the big issues. And you can imagine my surprise. Although I had been working in this architectural office, which was in a Baroque 17th century building with big vaults, and couldn't have been more gorgeous. And you can imagine my surprise when I came and saw that my office was in the only building that Corbusier had built in North America, and I was the first person to occupy my office, and I was absolutely delighted. I might, if we still have time, I might tell an anecdote about how some exhibitions start off not with a whole lot of intellectual planning. I was in Vienna, where I had studied for a while, and I had met, while I was at Harvard, I met a young law student who invited me up to his loft. And that loft was on the Ring, which is the sort of mighty boulevard of Vienna. and a beautiful old house, and the loft was full of just wooden structure all over, carrying the roof. And that's where he lived. And I was amazed to see that everywhere you look, it's a huge space, it's just the roof of this big apartment building. I was amazed to see that everywhere you looked, there was a tonneau chair. And some of them were rocking chairs, and some of them were some of the chairs that Edward showed. And after a few minutes there, I said, John, I have an idea. And so I had to play it with Edward, and eventually it became the tonneau show. He brought his, what was it, probably 30 partly very large chairs to Harvard, to the Carpenter Center, and it worked beautifully in that space.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, Edward, to give some brief comments.
Can you speak this line?
I was among the first group of students to take classes at Carpenter Center when it opened. And also, during that year, I was the guard at that first exhibition during opening hours. I took studios at Carpenter Center for 3 years when I was at Harvard College. And among them, Will Ryman's studio. I was not one of his best students, I would say. So what did I get out of that? The kind of work that we did there, we were there for 3 afternoons a week for 2 or 3 hours. It was very different than the work that we did at the rest of our courses at Harvard College. And I can summarize what we got out of that in 4 words. The first is form. As we sat at those tables that you saw, we were making things, but we were doing a lot of talking as well. Talk was from professor to student, but also student to student. And it all centered around one common theme, which is what are the attributes of form, and what makes good form. And I think through all of that talk, we learned to discriminate about form. And those kinds of courses, I think, went out of favor in the following decade. And when I came back, I was living in England in the 70s, and I came back to teach at the design school. And I noticed a big difference that students who had taken those kinds of courses, whether at Harvard or elsewhere, were able to talk and think about form, but those who had missed them weren't. And I found them severely handicapped in that respect. The second thing that I think we took away from these courses was a love of making. When I started at the designs, as a student at the design school, there were no courses in construction for some reason. But maybe there still aren't. But for one reason or another, I think largely because of the way we emphasized here at Carpenter Center, the manipulation of materials. Construction is not, I'm an architect, it's never been alien to me. And we just learned that not only could you almost make anything, but there was a real pleasure in making. Third word that comes to mind, and it's kind of paradoxical, is art. And I say paradoxical because this was not an art curriculum. In some ways, it might have been preparatory to an art training, but what we were making in these studios wasn't art. But nevertheless, there was a lot of discussion about art among us students and the faculty about contemporary trends and tendencies. And it's been very important to my life. When I graduated, I was given a fellowship to study in England, and I think it was expected that I'd go to Oxford or Cambridge, but instead I went to the Slade School, which is an art school in London, and I did painting for a year. And when I came back to the design school, it took me about 1 week to realize that I couldn't be an architect and paint at the same time. It was just not enough hours in a day. But I've had a lifelong interest in contemporary art, and so I'm very thankful for Carpenter Center for that. And finally, I'll say the other word that comes to mind, and it's misused and overused and abused, but in terms of Carpenter Center, it was very apt, and this is community. The human relationships were enormous and important at Carpenter Center. You know, in retrospect, I was, as an undergraduate, an editor of this magazine, Connection, which basically was centered at the design school. Charlie Jenks, who was then a student of the design school, was the head of it. And for the life of me, I can't really remember how I got drawn into Connection. But I edited a number of issues. One of them had an article by you, Edward, and another had an article about Mirko. And I have to say, in retrospect, that I'm amazed and very humbled that basically you work with me as a kind of colleague and collaborator. And that was so true of all the other relationships at Carpenter Center. It wasn't just a place for courses. It was a center of some sort. And this continued even when I was at the design school. At that point, another professor came to Carpenter Center, J.D. Jackson, who also accepted me, took me in, became a friend, and was very influential as I got my first book ready for publication. So, you know, Howard, as you said, 50 years ago, it's a long time, but it was very formative for me, and it seems only like yesterday, actually, as I remember these things.
Thank you.
Just before we move on, I just want to acknowledge David Roderick, who's the current director of the Carpenter Center, who's joined us, and also Professor Juliana Bruno, who is one of the professors there, who also teaches at the GSD. So this collaboration goes on. It's interesting to hear the report, because a number of the people here at the school also have been involved with this new initiative called the Harvard University Committee on the Arts and Committee on Arts and Design now. And it's actually, in a way, trying to figure out what are some of the contemporary, today's sort of possibilities in terms of the arts. And I think if we can end up out of with another Carpenter Center as a result of this report, this would be a fantastic thing. But I think there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of initiative now to try and see how the university really engages with arts and design. So if you have any thoughts, any reflections on what the university should do, please don't hesitate to let some of us know what is happening. I just want to also say that it's been really amazing for me for a long, long time to have this incredible honor of being able to work and be associated with Edward, because he is a tough cookie. I mean, he mentioned the Carpenter Center and the new building of Renzo Piano. A few years ago, Toshiko Mori, who's here, Mr. Toshiko Mori from architecture, a few others, and Edward came together, and really they were quite concerned about this question of the ramp. And I'm happy to say that, you know, through that initiative, we were able to actually protect, to some degree, the Carpenter Center. I think through that process, we probably not attracted too many new admirers, because this also, from an architectural perspective, was an expensive thing to do. It would have been a lot cheaper to cut the ramp and move it and preserve it in jelly and then bring it back. But I think, you know, both Edward and Toshiko were very adamant, and I think we were able to really push and make a contribution, I hope, in the long run. So I think Edward's role as really an activist today is very, very important in terms of the issues of preservation, as well as, of course, the contribution that's been made. One last thing, I think, you know, these ideas that you're presenting are very much still part and parcel of the ethos of the GSD. What should be the first semester of architecture? What are the things that we should be doing? What is the relationship between, projective forms of imagination, about making, about the relationship of form to ideas? And we really need to be continuously inspired by this work. So it's coming back, and it's very much still part and parcel of the life of the school. So Edward, thank you again very, very much. And shall we follow and go to the library and see what he has?